Drawing Power is an anthology that stokes the fires of progressive social upheaval in the fight for a better, safer world. Moderating tonight's panel is Columbia University library curator and comics scholar Karen Green, at the very end of the table here. Karen has served as a Will Eisner Comics Industry Awards judge, of the jury for the Pulitzer Prize in Editorial Cartooning, serves as vice president of the board of directors of the Society of Illustrators, and has taught and lectured on comics in academia, and curated the fall 2014 exhibition, quote, Comics at Columbia, Past, Present, and Future, end quote, in Columbia's rare book and manuscript library, where she is Columbia's first ever curator for comics and cartoons, something I really appreciate. Thank you so much for doing that. We're so grateful to have so many incredible talents in one room. I think this is the biggest panel perhaps that we've ever had. So that's a milestone for us. So please help me in welcoming all of our panelists and Karen Green to the Strand.
Thank you, Nick. First of all, thanks to the Strand, to Abrams Comic Arts for publishing this remarkable book, and to Diane for inviting me to be part of this evening with this power squad of artists lined up here. Before we get started, how many of you have seen the book before tonight? Anybody? So those of you who've seen it know, Charlie, the editor-in-chief has. Those of you who've seen it know that this is very powerful, disturbing material. So if anybody feels that it's overwhelming and they want to get up and walk out, you do it with no judgment and with our full support. Don't feel any self-consciousness about that. So, Diane Noonan, founding mother of underground comics. Well, just about. Just about. Creator of the character Dee Dee Glitz, co-editor of the Twisted Sisters anthologies, contributor to Women's Comics, Harvey and Eisner Award nominee, yada, yada, yada. Okay, that's enough. Apparently that's enough. We could go on. Can you talk a little bit about your motivation for this? If we go to the intro. Oh, there we go. This serves as kind of the kickoff, which is very appropriate because this is possibly in many ways the catalyst for the entire project. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was just going to read something from the introduction, and if then there are more questions that aren't covered, then you can, okay? So this is partly edited from the introduction I wrote for Drawing Power. I was just coming out of the anesthesia, so embarrassed when I saw the doctor's hand on my breast that I froze. Later, I was angry at myself for that all too common reaction. After all, I was 25, a feminist, a contributor to women's comics. I should have slapped him, reported him, something. Bombarded by the recent influx of celebrities, which doesn't seem to stop, just ongoing, accused of sexual misconduct in the media, repressed memories of sexual assault started coming back to me. Not just the sleazy doctor, but the helpful, in quotes, friend, and the guilt-inducing ex. I became obsessed with images of the regular guy as sexual predator, walking among us unseen. Was that ordinary man stalking the ordinary woman walking in front of him? What about the oblivious teenage girl with earbuds in leaving the subway at midnight? I lost my place, wait a second. Oh, here. The older woman with a cane, anyone? The older woman with a cane, or anyone waiting at a deserted bus stop. I just started seeing vulnerability everywhere and feeling it too. So many women, so many untold stories, women who blame themselves, women afraid to report their sexual assaults. These thoughts, my memories, and the explosive effect of the Me Too movement on women worldwide all made me want to fight back. I'm a cartoonist and an editor, and that was the only way I could fight back, as a cartoonist and an editor, and that's when I got the idea for this book. The artists in this collection present themselves not as victims, but rather as truth tellers, shining light on the dirty secrets of abusers. When I titled this anthology Drawing Power, I intended to call upon the power of storytelling and comic art to directly confront sexual trauma. I believe that together we have done that. So that's it. You can ask me more if you want. 2 minutes.
So, yes, that is 2 minutes. I think we'll go through everybody, and then I have some kind of general questions I'd like to ask. So,
Say that was all the names were coming back around me. I was drowning in the names. Unfortunately, Jeffrey Epstein didn't make it because his book was started a while ago.
Next comes Katie Free-cos, who's a cartoonist here in the city. Her nonfiction essay comics have appeared in The Guardian, The New Yorker, and elsewhere. She's the creator of Checked Out, a comic about working at New York City's oldest library that runs regularly on medium.com Spiral Bound. Katie, can you talk a little bit about your piece?
Hi. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I think this was one of those things that you're really grateful to be included in, and then you like wish you didn't have to do it. So it's like a bittersweet moment, I think, to see it all together. Yeah, my comic was 12 instances of just like innocuous bullshit that you have to put up with. Just not, like a serious assault, but just basic assaults on your everyday life. So I thought of this particular idea, which is a lot in the book. I know a lot of people kind of showed their everyday experiences with sexual violence. And my dad once asked me if I'd ever been catcalled on the street, and I was like,
Duh.
I'm like, what a fucking stupid question. It's like, but it occurs to me that like, maybe a large number of the population doesn't even know that, half of us live a particular existence in this way. So my comic was just to highlight those little moments.
And I should say that if you're following along in your book, Katie's on page 191. And this is kind of a fitting way to kick off this evening because it does present kind of a litany of examples that I would say probably every woman in this room has experienced at one time or another.
Yeah, so there's number 11. There's me at the dinner table being like, I don't know. And then, it's just like little things that you kind of start taking stock. I mean, this comic honestly could have been like 700 pages, but, I stopped and, and then I also like to be kind of funny, even when it's not appropriate. So number 12 is my little like, that's great. Yeah. My little comeback.
Okay, this is not the order that I had it in. Next, Ariel Marriott Marquis looks at kind of the harassment in what many of us like to think of as the supposedly safe space of the comics community, in this case, San Diego Comic-Con. Ariel, can you talk a little bit about yours?
Sure. So I wanted to write about the experience of when I drew a lot of comics as a teenager and would go to these comic book conventions and got a lot of attention from older men that really kind of motivated me to keep drawing comics. It was, overwhelmingly positive. It was like, these are great, you got to keep doing this, I love this, and it really gave me the confidence to become a professional cartoonist. But the flip side was that a lot of those men were also completely inappropriate with me. Everything from, asking me really personal questions to actually groping me and molesting me. And I think it's, this is a common experience for people starting out in really any kind of field where you have to negotiate the positive and the negative. And so I wanted to look at what that was like.
What's interesting to me about this in many ways is that, I said the supposedly safe space of comics, but in the wake of Me Too, we found out so much about ways in which comics were not a safe space. And so this fits really profoundly into that narrative. Caitlin Cass, Surprise Bogs, talks a little bit about the need for nuance in the surprise bogs of a woman navigating society. Caitlin, I saw here that you're the one, I had forgotten that you published The Great Moments in Western Civilization, which I was on the subscription list for a long time, but I seem to have let lapse, so we need to talk later.
Cool.
It's great. You should all subscribe to it. But let's talk about this.
Okay, so my comic is about teaching at an all-girls school in the wake of the Me Too movement, and having difficult conversations, but also trying to avoid what often happens when you have a conversation about a taboo topic, which is just completely overgeneralizing or oversimplifying in order to get out of the awkwardness of that conversation. And it's also about me reflecting on an experience I had with a professor in graduate school who abused his power and was very gropey and inappropriate with me. And sort of thinking about that in relationship to then being a teacher, and how it sort of changes your perspectives of a teacher-student relationship.
Somebody needs to...
I'm sorry, Jenny, somebody needs...
Oh, it just jumped around. I think it went back to where...
It did.
Oh,
it
it's
went back
okay.
to where I
Yeah.
needed it to go. It went forward. This was a little sticky. Sorry about that. Sorry, was there anything else you wanted to say, Caitlin?
That was all. Yeah.
Okay. Miss did Ever Present, which comes right after Diane's at the beginning. You talk a little bit about the need to be constantly vigilant, but still kind of undismayed and unstoppable. So talk a little bit about the context of this.
I mean, you need to live your life, and I think what I was commenting on is how infuriating it is that you can't just be left alone in a space, that you can't just exist as a human being the way a man would in any given space. There's always an eye out for who's behind me, who's here. And my story is actually about how infuriatingly common these kind of stories are, to the point where it almost becomes the background noise of the feminine existence. And I was walking down the street and thinking of which one of these garbage men that I know of from a personal story or a friend's story or a family member's story I wanted to write about in this anthology. And while I was actually contemplating it, this happened. And I feel like if that doesn't say it all, I don't know what does.
This is really, oh my gosh, this is very sticky. There we go.
And that's me looking pissed.
Yeah, with good reason. Sorry about this. I'm sorry about the... Let's hit it. There we go. Shavon. Shavon's is one page, and it starts off quite innocuously, and then it punches you in the gut at the end. And it looks at kind of the jokes that we all hear. So could you talk a little bit about that? This is not the entire page, I should say.
Yeah. So the entire thing is basically a very pleasant experience that I was having with some friends. Soon after high school, I was hanging out with close guy friends of mine that I'd known since age 8 or whatever. And in my mind, I don't know, there's people that you kind of feel comfortable with and that you feel like you can let your guard down and you're not so self-aware, self-conscious. But then there are some people that you shouldn't really let your guard down with. And even if they, nothing physically bad happened that night, there was still an interruption of peace. Basically, yeah, one of my good friends just made an offhanded comment of a reminder that I'm not safe, even with people that I feel safe with. And I don't even remember that, so he said, "Hey, Shavon, we could totally rape you right now." And I don't even remember anything happening conversation-wise. I think it was just haha, that's Josh, let's walk over this way now. And that didn't even stand out in my mind at the time because I was it's a joke, smile, smile, laugh, because I'm hanging out with the guys and that's just the type of humor that certain people have. But there's so many moments like that, looking back on your life, there's so many things that you let slide because it's easier that way and because it's necessary, because otherwise you would be the one always nagging about what's inappropriate. Quote unquote nagging. So yeah, that was as a teen, just dealing with not reacting to those things, basically.
Kaylee, your comic deals with family abuse, PTSD, and the nature of memory. So could you talk a little about that?
Yeah, so this comic was my first time really reckoning with my childhood through art. It took me a very long time to even realize that I had an abusive father, because when you grow up with something like that, it gets normalized and you can't talk about it to anyone, so you think that that's just how all parents are. So this comic was really my first time examining that, and it's a tough experience to do that, because making a comic, you have to sit with it for a very long time and sit in your thoughts about it. But it was really cathartic for me to examine my PTSD and the way I remember things through this lens.
But that final panel doesn't leave you with complete closure, does it?
Yeah, it's definitely it's always an ongoing process, is the thing about trauma and PTSD and memory. You can't really escape it, but I'm working on it.
It's a process. Oh gosh, this is really not working. There we go. Georgeanna, your to a certain extent, these are kind of ramping up as we go forward. Georgiana's comic looks at rape and its consequences, complicated by a complete lack of parental support, paternal support specifically. So could you talk a little bit about that, Georgeanna?
Sure. I should say I didn't know what story to tell when Diane asked me to do this. And so I started thinking about the aftermath of a very early bad experience, which was this one. And the worst thing, it's a very straightforward story of rape, but the worst thing about it was actually the aftermath, was how everyone treated me and how that isn't it.
No, I know.
Anyway, so my father, who I had a great relationship with, I thought, asked me that question, are you sure it was rape and you weren't just, curious? And it undid me for 30 years.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, the kind of that coda at the bottom, what the aftermath was, is almost as difficult to read as the panel itself.
Yeah. I did it in a very straightforward way, and kind of the whole thing was about the very introduction and the very end.
Yeah. Jenny, your comic, very powerful comic, deals to a certain extent with the mental and physical manifestations of being raped and your father's way of helping you.
This is pretty much it just sort of opens with, this is just a paradigm shift of this, when I was 14 also, this act that happened to me when we'd moved out into the desert. We didn't move into we moved to Arizona. My mother, who's here with us in the audience tonight, and this man who was actually a fugitive at the time for another crime he'd committed, and I was out in the desert near on the outskirts, and this, you can see what's happening here. He took my virginity, and it, did a lot of, I dealt with heavy PTSD from this throughout my life, as well as certain physical aftermaths. And so part of it is that I think both my mother and my father in this comic gave me advice that was harsh but practical, but the crux of the story in my dealing with it, I guess talking about, is on one of my visits back to New York, my father would take me to Tin Pan Alley, which was a bar that used to be in Hell's Kitchen, which is where we're all from, and he hung out there, and I would sit and draw, and we could ask what a minor is doing in there, but whatever, it's New York in the 80s. And so I don't know, you don't have the panel where he notices how, and when I was 16 dealing with this, and I'm shaking and all very depressed, and he tells me, learn to kill. And he took me down to 42nd Street to a military shop and between 8th and 9th, and bought me a little military boot knife, which I named Blackie. And part of my catharsis in therapy was learning to use this knife, either to do tricks with it, to pull it out fast. Unfortunately, I don't have Blackie here today to show you, because one day going to the SSI office, I forgot to leave him at home, and they confiscated him and wouldn't give him back. But part of my catharsis was learning to fight with the knife and take it out fast, twirl it, do tricks with it. And, I guess this, I know that's not the most touchy-feely coping method, but it worked for me. It worked. And, my dad couldn't be with us. He hurt his back doing some repairs around the house, but, I'm glad this is being taped for YouTube, so I'll show it to him later. So that's what it's about, I guess, how, there's not only one way of coping with trauma, and, coping with trauma is a lifelong thing, and there's no right or wrong other than inflicting your pain on other people, possibly. There's no right or wrong method of, resolution to these sorts of things. And that's about it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And that makes an effective segue to yours, Kendra, which is indeed about methods of survival.
Is this on?
There's a little switch on the bottom.
It is on? Oh, okay.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, so how appropriate, I was right after you. I had an opportunity to tell one of my own experiences that actually what's ironic is after I'd already finished this piece, I kind of was like, oh, I actually have something I could have done a piece on. but it's done now. So at the time I decided to, I have a close family member who has an extremely abusive brother, and it really destroyed them. Like, obviously, like with trauma, it doesn't go away, and I've seen them go through several episodes of, just having flashbacks. And I kind of wanted to tackle the topic of what you were saying with, like, even if you're like, a feminist, you're within the space, you kind of sometimes have to realize that you might be criticizing a method that someone else has, even though you think you're helping. But I actually caught myself eventually I was being very judgmental of this person. So I realized that, and I decided to kind of admit that I had done that, so other people can kind of think about that. That even if you're within the space, it's possible to accidentally, shame somebody's method. So
we all have our own ideas of what works, and sometimes it doesn't work so well for others.
I saw it work for her, and then I was like, oh, shut up, Kendra. So I decided to do that because I think that that's not really tackled a lot. So
thank you. And finally, Jen Camper, non-compliant. I thought that this was a fitting one to end on because you literally say that comics allow you to have the last word.
On the subway coming here, some random guy called me a bitch and told me that I didn't know if I was a man or a woman. And I sat down, and it really took me like 5 minutes, and then I started laughing, thinking, how appropriate that this happened on the way to the event. But it took me that long to even make the connection, and I think what's so infuriating about all these stories is how much we have to ignore all this bullshit just to go through our lives. I didn't want to draw this cartoon because I don't draw autobiography, and I hate drawing women being victimized. And my first attempt, Diane was like, no, you can't do a fictional story. Why don't you do it? And so I did a comic about why I don't want to do this comic.
In my comics, I get the final word.
Yeah, I don't like doing autobiography at all. And it's just, I don't understand why anybody would, because all my comics, the women win in the end, and this was just really not my thing.
Thank you. Well, now I have a question for all of you. Kaylee, I think actually you addressed this to a certain extent already. In Carta Monir's story, she has the line on the last panel, I almost threw up drawing this comic. And many of these stories recount, either explicitly or implicitly, the repercussions of trauma in one's own life. So what was the experience of making these comics for you? Was it cathartic? Was it traumatic? Was it therapeutic? Was it all or none of the above? And now you get to choose who answers that first.
I'll go ahead.
Here you go, miss.
I think it was everything you said except for traumatic. I think comics, I started drawing them, and I've done a couple autobio books, which it's okay. It's okay if you're into that, for Fantagraphics. And comics are the medium where it's not just getting the last word, it's where you always win, because even when it's a story about how you lost or how you were hurt, the reader sees it through your eyes, and you take control of the narrative, so no matter what happens in the story, you win, and this was like one of those. The text between me and Kevin about what had happened, I really did end it with that like arrogant and just being an asshole and saying like, I'm unstoppable. Like, because when he was like, oh, are you okay? Okay. Because that's just who I am, but it's nice to be able to put out that narrative, and hopefully that is like a little cheery note in what's otherwise an incredibly depressing subject matter.
I think that what was most difficult for me about writing this was, so my story is of this one time that this man at a comics convention sort of like gave me a place to crash at his hotel and ended up groping me throughout the night. And I had many experiences like this, but this particular story was based on a very specific event with a specific person, and this question of how much to reveal of who he is. He's a known person in the comics world. And the last thing I wanted was him to contact me or to have anything to do with him again. And also, I didn't want to have to deal with, oh, well, now you're making this accusation. All right, so now is this, what do you really remember? Were there witnesses? Like, if you're going to, quote unquote, call somebody out, suddenly needing to be put on trial, in a sense, about an event, which was not what I was interested in doing. And also legal matters. Like, I think Abrams was like, well, we can't reveal people. And so I ended up really disguising this person. And in a way, I was glad because I didn't want to deal with it, but it also felt unfair that I should have to put all this effort into fictionalizing him, which in a way I felt made this story not as strong as if I could have stuck to those real life details that are always the best. So that was, I think that's what was challenging for me.
I think for me, it was a bit tough to make this comic. I feel like as much as it was cathartic for me to get it out there and to speak publicly about this for the first time in my life, I think that the act of drawing it and just remembering all of these things that I went through as a child, and it made me, it was upsetting, but it also made me really angry while I was drawing it, that I was, robbed of a normal, happy childhood. And I feel like that's a response that a lot of people who have gone through child abuse can probably relate to. So as much as it was cathartic, it was also like really a struggle to make.
Yeah. I did throw up while I was making this. Yeah, my husband's going, yeah, a lot. I was also doing a lot of the drawing at the time of the Kavanaugh hearing, so it just seems like it amplified it. I know my social worker counselor was just, why don't you just not do it? And I felt like I need to do this story. I think this book is an important thing to have these stories out there. At the time, I'm also, since that time, since getting it out there, I feel like there's a way to detachment. It was nuts. About a month after completing it, like I said, this guy was also a fugitive for some other crimes. I saw him on forensics files. But it seems like since getting this done, I've been able to sort of, not that I'm over it, but I've been able to detach from it to a degree more than I was in the past. And currently I've been talking, where I go for therapy, they've been talking to me about possibly doing peer counseling to help other people who've been raped, peer-to-peer. It's not like, being a actual psychologist, but it's a kind of a fairly new position that's been created. My husband does it for people in recovery for addiction, and I think that would be a very positive thing for me to do. So something good came out of, doing this work.
I really procrastinated. I didn't want to do it. I was like fuck this sucks. And then I think a lot of the time, people who are like a member of a particularly disenfranchised group, you have to bring people in as this tour guide into your experience. And so, yeah, I've been thinking a lot. I want to do a comics anthology called, what would I call it? Called Sucking at It. It's open for cis white men to contribute to. And in it, you get to tell us how you abused your power. And, I would love to read that. So,
do you think you're going to get a lot of submissions?
Everybody really got, hurt having to do this work, and I think everybody's tired, and, we could use a little assistance. Maybe ask yourself, what it's like to have to say these things, to have to limit your art, to change someone's appearance when they were such an asshole to you. All of these things, we're going to need you to stand up. That's all I have to say about that.
Yeah. I was thinking of a line that Emil Ferris, who actually closes this book, said in a completely different context on a panel at San Diego last year. She said, "Our wounds are what we use to heal ourselves." And I guess if we're lucky, that's true. And somehow, to a certain extent, that did feel like what this book hopefully could accomplish for the women telling the stories in it. Kelly Phillips' story, Fire, includes the line, "That's the real lasting legacy. They get to deny it and move on and pretend it never happened like that. But we know better, and we have to live with it." This forcefully reminded me of the Kavanaugh hearings, especially among a host of other similar examples and memories. And I'm wondering, do you see the possibility of change? Do books such as this, telling stories as these, do you feel that they begin to affect change?
I think that basically this book is getting it out there. It's not saying how things will change or when it's going to change, but we have seen incredible change through the Me Too movement. I mean, it used to be that always the man was believed in a case what he said, she said, and the woman had to prove it. And now it's turned topsy-turvy, and men have to prove that they didn't do it. A lot. I'm not saying all over and all the time, but it's definitely, in a very short amount of time, had an incredible impact on society. This is just, I think this is like the peer therapy that you were talking about, Jenny. It was like, I got replies from almost everybody said this was the hardest story they ever did. And there were some people that couldn't, had to stop because one woman was getting sued by the person that she accused. So she had to drop out because that was the story she was going to do. And I just think that one book can make people talk more about the subject. And the more openness that, except for one person, every woman that I talked to about doing this had a story. Oh, right, yeah, okay, Not that it was easy, and it's still ongoing. It's not like we did a book and, okay, we solved it, but we made people talk about it. That's right.
May I say something? Is it okay?
Sure.
You're so right, because you're so right. As I was explaining to people why I was coming here and what my daughter had done, every woman I spoke to, if they didn't have a personal story, they've been working with somebody. And I'm shipping a bunch of books back. I'm even going to have it at my spiritual center to help the counselors.
Yes.
You never know what's beautiful, and thank you so much, everyone, every word, because you never know who wrote the magical word that's going to really help somebody open up and get that healing going. So you women are incredible. I don't know why I'm shaking, but you're incredible, you're amazing, and Thank you so much for doing what you've done. You have no idea how many people are going to be reached by this. It's
Thank you.
important work. Keep it going.
Any other thoughts on that? Kendra, I saw you had the mic in your hand. I didn't know if there was something that you wanted to... Just fidgeting. Excellent. Excellent. No, that's fine. So have all of you seen the other stories in the book? Some yes, some no. So for those of you who have, when Me Too started, what I was seeing on Twitter and on Facebook was not just one woman, one story, but one woman, as in, Katie's comic, with kind of the litany, like this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. So for the most part, other than Katie, you were limited to one story. Were there other stories in the book that when you read it, it kind of hit you? Because sometimes you even forget stuff that's happened. I remember I made my list and then things kept on, when I saw things that other women had, it's like, oh wait, no, that happened to me too. And then I had to write that as well. So were there other stories that you saw in the book that kind of hit you hard? And if so, what were they?
Oh. They came in one at a time. And after a while, it just kind of piled up. It's very emotional responses. And it was interesting because there's so many sort of themes that reoccurred. The freezing is one. And, not being able to react to an invasion of your space. That's not including rape. I think that breaks the barrier, and I think people freeze then too. It's just. And another theme is, 30 years later, I'm in my therapist's office and I'm finally telling this story to somebody and I'm crying. These things stay with us. They live in our bodies and they come out at just, I think reading this book will be painful for some people, and they'll have to put it down because they will find that one story that they really connect with. Another thing I noticed in a lot of the stories were that people remember odd things. Like Carol Tyler did a story, and she's raped in a trailer, and she can describe everything about the trailer, the kind of light there was, there was a radio that looked like a certain way, and a lot of people remember what they were wearing, down to the details. And there's a very harrowing one done by Lulu Stanley, and she describes being raped. And it's horrible. I mean, it's a letter that she wrote to her sister at the time, and she was in college. And she can describe what the guy was wearing, what she was wearing, what she did to try to convince him not to hurt her and not to use a knife. It was just vivid, very vivid. And when you combine pictures with that, it's very powerful.
I think reading this book was incredibly difficult, and I could only read it in very short, one or two stories at a time. And I found that if I read too many, I was distancing myself, and I wasn't allowing myself to even feel the story because I couldn't. And I think that's what we do, is we get bombarded with this shit so much that we distance ourselves, we numb ourselves to it, we forget it happens, we don't even acknowledge how regular it is. And so I think there was a parallel between reading the stories in the book and how difficult it was and how much I was distancing myself from it because it was too much, and then what we go through in our day-to-day life, and how so many of us, like Karen said, we go, oh yeah, then this happened. Oh yeah, and then there was that time when that guy threw that rock, and so it's not an easy book to read at all.
Anyone else?
I still am trying to go through it because I had the same thing where I got it in the mail and I was like, oh boy, time to read, and then I looked and it was like 9 p.m. and I just put it down. I was like, I'm not going to sleep. But for me, it was more like the existence like of the book. I mentioned this briefly before, where the existence of the book kind of affected me, like the fact that I was in it and holding it, and then it got me thinking about something. This was actually like a rare case where it was a classmate who was also a girl, which is, kind of rare, and I hadn't really thought about that. So as I kind of flipped through it, and there was a lot of diverse, culprits of it. And then that got me thinking. And I'm still kind of piecing it together, but I'm kind of at a point where I was like, oh, all right. So that's how that affected me, and I'm hoping that when I actually read all of it, I'm hoping I don't have another thing that I figure out. But yeah, I appreciate that, honestly, because again, it's like you were saying, someone's gonna get something out of it where it might trigger something where they kind of realize that something might have happened. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I agree with, it's very difficult to read. I haven't gotten through the entire book yet because it ends up being very overwhelming within just a couple pages. But the week after I got my copy in the mail, I talked to my therapist about being assaulted for the first time I ever said it out loud. So it has an effect knowing that you're not alone. It's really powerful, and it's unfortunate that it needs to be, but it is,
I had that same reaction. When I looked at a lot of it, I was almost shaking. It almost made me ill. And also, I recognized so many of the experiences. I was like, oh yeah, that happened. Oh yeah, that happened. And combining that with incredible sympathy for everyone who's in it, and feeling the hugeness of it, that everybody has a story. It's horrific.
As I was reading it, I was reminded of a blog post from probably 12, 15 years ago. There's a blogger named Sarah Bunting. She was one of the founders of Television Without Pity, and she had a blog of her own, and she was writing about sexual assault. And she said that men can leave their wallets at home, they can leave their jewelry at home, they cannot go out in their expensive car, but every time a woman walks out on the street, she is forced to carry with her the potential target of a man with bad intentions. And this book was just this kind of onslaught of examples of just walking through your life and never being entirely safe, which is a really high note to stop on and ask for questions from the audience. Do people on the audience have any questions for the panelists? They can have mine. 3 or 4 questions.
Well, I just want to commend each and every one of you for being brave and for moving past your fears and the act that had you stuck, silent, and hidden for so long. I mean, even though you ladies said that it had you, it was hard for you to write it, just the fact that you wrote it, the healing has started. I'm a survivor, overcomer of childhood abuse, and I'm working on a book, and I'm experiencing a lot of the same things. Like, I'm kind of stuck, but I'm going through the process, but it's taking so long. Like, I feel like I have to do so much because I want to be very graphic. So I just want to know, do you have any, how long did it take for you? I know it's a comic, but how long did it take, to really, I guess you can't put a time frame on it, but any tips on how to just kind of just push past it? The difficult.
For me, I just, if this is autobio, it might be a little different, but for me, I just called the person and I just had them, we had a limited amount of time that I was able to talk to them. So we had half an hour, and I was just just give me bullet points.
Okay.
Just tell me everything. So you might be able to find a way to do that where it's it's ironic, but maybe find a time where it's like, I have this amount of time. How do I crunch this down into just like the basic points? And then from there, I was able to flesh it out more. Because that's less daunting to me, and like if I immediately start with like, here's every little detail. So that's what I did. I just had that limited time, and I created like an outline and went from there.
Can I ask you something? You said you can't reveal the person's identity. Like, how does that work? You can't reveal the person's identity, the abuser? Right. So you just make up a name?
Right. That was what Ariel was talking about having to change the way the person looked. And
I mean, it's not you. There's various laws around slander. So if you're saying something about somebody that is true, that's okay. Right. I chose not to reveal the person's identity because I didn't want to have to interact with them or answer any questions. But for your own experience, you know, it's really, I think a story can be just as true and powerful if you choose to disguise the person, and it will still be truthful. But I don't think you should be afraid to reveal them if you are telling the truth.
I just wanted to know the laws. Thank you.
Hi. This one, okay. So first, I think, just kind of following up with what you were saying, wanted to thank you guys, honestly, for telling your story. I feel like now, thank God, with the Me Too movement, there are more people that are telling their stories out loud and in public, as opposed to just to your, close relatives or close friends. I was curious as to your with your stories. Some of you mentioned that you shared with a parent or shared with someone else. There are many women that haven't shared their story with anyone. My experience, I did not talk about for about 30 years. And so I was curious as to whether any of you had experience in taking on this project. Was this the first time that you were telling your story out loud? If so, how do you feel now that it's in print and it's out there?
For me, this was the first time, not that I said it out loud because some of my very close friends knew that I came from a history of abuse, but the first time that I had it out there for anyone who wasn't already very close to me to see, and the first time that I publicly labeled it as abuse and PTSD. And I feel like naming something has a lot of power. There was a temptation while I was drawing it to, my comic was about my father being abusive, and there was a temptation to just put his full name, put where he's living, just to name it. And there's, it's a really tough thing to say something for the first time, but.
Where a woman who was abused threatens that she will someday, when she finds the right moment, reveal everything about him, and she wants to burn his house down. But right now she's just telling the story, but there's so much anger in it. It's amazing.
Hi, great work. I look forward to seeing the whole book. I did a story too in which I talk about my instinct not in your book, elsewhere, where as a 13-year-old I instinctively did not want to talk to the police, even when they wanted to talk to me. Did anybody else have an experience with the police that answers that question? Is it worth the trauma? Did anybody have an experience where that was the right thing to do? Because I asked myself that.
women in the book, Marion Henley, she got raped, and she basically is telling her story in metaphor about getting run over by tanks. But she does go to court, and she thinks he got convicted, but he got off for being crazy. And nobody bothered to tell her. So I would say her experience was terrible, but I think it's individual.
Okay. Initially, while I was in the hospital getting the whole rape kit thing done, they were very, at first, until they linked it up with some other crimes that had been committed. They were very lackadaisical. They were asking my mother and stepfather if I was the kind of kid who made things up for attention. Since I was always kind of an artistically inclined kid and good at drawing, I made a sketch for the police of the guy's face, and my mother can verify this. While they were all out in the waiting room, one of the police said, "Oh, yeah, I've seen this guy around," and then just kind of tossed the sketch aside. But,
No, the policeman, we were appalled. The policeman...
Oh, he's handing you a microphone.
We were just appalled. The policeman, she sketched the bastard, and the policeman said, "Oh, I know him. I know the part of the desert he lives in, and he was just released from jail." And they had the helicopters overhead, searchlighting the whole desert. So I thought they were going to have him that night. 3 days later, nothing happens. I had to go charging into the police chief's office and demand, and it's still... Should I finish it, or?
I'd also like to add, I think this has more than something to do with the fact that my father's not here. We are a mixed family. My name being Gonzalez, my mother is Irish. I'm light, but she's lighter than I am. If my name wasn't that, I think Phoenix police would have hopped on it a little bit more. I personally do very much believe that. But it's, I don't want to okay, not all blue, okay. But I could see where your instinct that police might not be taking it. I can't, yes, and eventually the dude who did this to me was caught. My case was tacked on with other things. But I think if it had solely been my case, probably not. No.
Yep.
I just want to say that if you read this book, you're going to see that there's all different kinds of stories as we've kind of gone over here, like different ways that people have felt assaulted and different ways people have been assaulted. And I just thought of an answer to your question about the Brett Kavanaugh or Kavanaugh, whatever his name is. One thing that case showed us, Christine Blasey Ford got up there and said what happened to her, but since it was just that she was held down at a party with some kids, the state basically sanctioned oh, is that it? That it's okay, and that, to me, that was the big takeaway, that because I definitely had that moment where you've been a kid at a party and I've never actually seen it so publicly treated as an assault, and then to see the government basically officially rubber stamp that and count that as not sexual assault is exactly what happened. So this book kind of revalidates those stories that are now going to be fought even harder by these predators. So
he's the one who's the chief abuser.
Just one thing to add to going to the police. In my story, I asked. I went into the storefront that was right next to where I was, and I asked them to call the police. And when I came back, they hadn't done it, and she's like, "Oh, my manager didn't want to do that." And so I called them myself, and they just asked if I needed an ambulance, and I said, "No, I'm fine. Just there's a guy running around on the street chasing women and grabbing women," and they did absolutely nothing. But I thought it was worth a shot. But of all the women I know who've been assaulted and raped, I can't think of a single one that's gotten anything from the police, even approaching a satisfactory conclusion. And I think that's why people don't call them, because they're going to question me, they're going to doubt me, they're going to put me through like an extra level on this fresh hell I'm in, and then for what?
I was lucky. I was not raped. I was assaulted, and I was 15 years old, taken to the police. They caught the guy. They took pictures of my wounds. They didn't say a word about the fact that I was wearing a bikini top and cutoffs. This was in the 70s in a suburb in New Jersey. I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with the time and the place. And as Jenny said, a lot has to do with who you are, right? I think you're absolutely right. Jenny actually goes into some detail about the way that she was singled out by classmates as well. So justice is not equal in this country, in this world.
And I'll say one thing.
Yes.
One really important thing about this book, which you may not be able to tell from this panel, is that you can tell it from this, actually. Let me get this. That we have artists from many, many different countries, different races, and different ages. I'm 72. The oldest woman is in her 80s. I don't know how old you are, Kaylee. You might be 20. So I just want...
That inclusiveness is important to you.
Yeah. Then you can see how the cultural differences affect what's happening, but it's still happening, and they're still going through the same experiences and having a lot of the same reactions. And it's really important to me that people understand that this book is aimed at everybody. This is everyone. There are a couple of trans artists in it. There's a lot of gay artists, and it's really trying to get everybody's stories connected. And that's what I feel about this book, is the connectiveness is a big part of it. And when you read it, you'll see there's women from Israel, and there's women from Egypt, and Great Britain, and France, and South America, Australia.
Yeah, I want to thank you, Diane, because you really put in a lot of effort to have that diversity, and it shows in the way the book is edited, and I know that's not an easy thing to do, so bravo.
So, thank you all for coming. Thank you to this amazing panel of strong and talented women. And thank you to Nick and the Strand for hosting this. And now we are going to have signings. Yes. And posters. Are the posters for free? For free! Free poster. And so thank you all for coming, and have a wonderful evening. And over to you, Nick.
Round of applause for everyone.